somewhere, beneath the same stars you see tonight, a land once trembled, not from war, but from silence. A silence so thick, it wrapped around villages like fog. A silence born not from peace, but from confusion. This is the story of a people who had everything they ever prayed for: freedom from slavery, a promise fulfilled, a land flowing with milk and honey. And yet, they couldn't sleep. Their nights were long, their hearts restless, their altars empty. Welcome to the Book of Judges. You may have heard it called a record of heroes, but tonight, let's hear it as something else. Let's hear it as a mirror. Because if you've ever felt like you've arrived only to realize you're still lost, if you've ever followed the right path, only to wake up wondering, is this all there is? Then you're not alone. You're walking the same dusty roads as the children of Israel. After Moses died, they crossed the Jordan. After Joshua led them, they claimed the cities. The walls of Jericho fell. The sun stood still. The promises seemed sealed. But then, Joshua died too, and with him, something else vanished. Not just a leader, but a memory of who God was, a memory of who they were meant to be. And in that quiet space left behind, doubt crept in, not with a roar, but with a whisper. Maybe the gods of this land are stronger. Maybe we don't need to be so strict. Maybe we can blend in just a little. And so they did. They kept the festivals but forgot the fire. They sang the songs but silenced the spirit. They lived in the land but never truly belonged to it, or to the one who gave it. Does that sound familiar? In our world today, we have more than ever. More information, more freedom, more choices, yet so many of us lie awake at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, asking, why do I still feel empty? Why does my soul ache, even when my life looks blessed? That's the ache of Judges. This book isn't really about battles, though there are many. It's not even about judges, though their names echo through time. At its core, the Book of Judges is about a cycle: rebellion, suffering, crying out, risque, peace, and then almost inevitably, rebellion again. 7 times, 7 cycles of falling and being lifted. 7 reminders that human hearts, left to themselves, always drift. But here's the wonder. Every single time they cried out, no matter how far they'd wandered, God heard, not because they deserved it, not because they fixed themselves first, but because His love doesn't wait for perfection. It runs toward brokenness. Tonight, as we journey through this ancient, overlooked book, we won't just hear about Othniel, Deborah, Gideon, or Samson. We'll meet them as real people, afraid, flawed, desperate, and deeply human. We'll sit under Deborah's palm tree. We'll hide with Gideon in the winepress. We'll feel the weight of Samson's chains. And in their stories, we might just see our own. Because the Book of Judges isn't just history, it's a diagnosis of the human soul. And hidden within its chaos is a quiet promise. Even in your darkest cycle, you are not beyond rescue. So let go of the day. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breath slow. We're not here to study the Bible like scholars. We're here to let it speak to us like a lullaby, one that acknowledges our pain and still whispers, rest, I'm with you. Over the next hours, we'll walk through valleys of despair and hills of sudden hope. We'll witness courage in women, weakness in warriors, and grace in the most unexpected places. But through it all, one truth will echo like a heartbeat. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Judges 17-6. And maybe that's why we need a king. Not a ruler of armies, but a shepherd of souls. Not one who demands our perfection, but one who enters our mess. But we'll get to him soon. For now, just listen, breathe, and let the story begin. Tonight, we fall asleep with the Book of Judges, not to escape reality, but to find, in its raw honesty, a deeper kind of rest. If this is your first time here, welcome, weary traveler. You've found late-night devotion, a quiet space in the noise of the world, a lantern lit for those who can't sleep, a voice that speaks softly when everything else shouts. This isn't another Bible summary. This isn't content designed to scroll past. This is for the ones who stay up late, not because they want to, but because their soul won't settle. We believe some of the deepest truths in Scripture were never meant to be shouted from stages, but whispered in the dark to hearts wide awake with questions. That's why here, we don't just read the Bible, we breathe it. We uncover stories that got buried under centuries of tradition. We listen to the voices history tried to silence, the women, the outcasts, the broken judges, the forgotten prophets. We explore the parts of Scripture that make us uncomfortable, because that's often where healing begins. You see, much of what you've been taught about faith has been polished, packaged, and simplified until it no longer feels real. But the Bible? The Bible is raw. It's messy. It's full of people who failed, doubted, ran away, and yet were still used by God. That's the kind of truth we share here. Not to impress you, but to free you. And if this space has brought you even a moment of peace tonight, if these words helped your racing thoughts slow down, if you felt for just a second less alone, then please, do 3 small things for us. First, tap the like button. Not because we're chasing numbers, but because that little gesture tells the algorithm, this matters. Share it with others who need rest. Second, subscribe and hit the bell. We're on a mission to reach 10,000 souls who are tired of shallow spirituality. People like you hungry for depth, honesty, and divine quiet. Your subscription isn't just support, it's solidarity. And third, if you're able, consider sending a super thanks, not out of obligation, but as a quiet thank you for the nights this channel has held you when the world felt too heavy. Every gift helps us keep this light burning so we can keep creating content that doesn't just inform, but transforms. Because the knowledge we share here, it's the kind that's been hidden, downplayed, even removed from mainstream faith narratives. But it's still there, in the margins of ancient scrolls, in the silence between verses, in the stories of people who looked a lot like us. So stay a while. You're not just a viewer here. You're part of a quiet fellowship, a community of seekers who believe that sometimes the deepest devotion happens late at night. Now, let's return to the story, to the land where stars watched over broken people, and God never stopped listening. The land was finally theirs. Not in dream, not in promise, but in soil, in stone, in sunrise. Over olive groves they now called their own. The Jordan had been crossed. Jericho had fallen. Ai had been conquered. The mountains of Ephraim, the valleys of Judah, the plains of Galilee, all of it stretched before them like a breath held too long and finally released. They had endured slavery in Egypt, wandered 40 years in the wilderness, watched giants fall, and witnessed the impossible become real. And now, they were home, or so they thought. For home is more than geography, it is belonging. And belonging requires memory. But memory is fragile, especially when peace arrives. When Joshua died, it wasn't just the loss of a leader, it was the closing of a door. He had walked with Moses. He had seen the Red Sea split. He had carried the weight of covenant in his bones. And with him gone, the living connection to that divine fire began to dim. The new generation had heard the stories, yes, but they had never tasted manna in the desert. They had never stood trembling at the edge of the Red Sea. They had inherited freedom, but not the hunger that guards it. And so, slowly, quietly, the promise began to feel less like a sacred trust and more like a possession. They planted their fields, built their homes, raised their children, but the altars grew cold. The stories became routine. The fear of the Lord gave way to the comfort of routine. They told themselves they were still faithful. After all, they lived in the land God gave them. They followed the festivals mostly. They avoided the worst of the Canaanite practices, or so they believed. But faith is not measured by what we avoid. It's revealed in what we love. And love, when left unattended, fades like embers in the wind. You know this feeling, don't you? That moment when a long-held dream finally comes true, and instead of joy, you feel a strange emptiness. When you get the job, the relationship, the home, the freedom you prayed for, and yet, something inside whispers, is this all? That's the ache of inheritance without intimacy. You can have everything God promised and still feel lost if you've lost the giver in the gift. The tribes of Israel stood on holy ground, yet their hearts wandered. They didn't reject God outright. They simply assumed his presence was automatic, like the sunrise. But covenant is not a transaction, it's a relationship. And relationships die in silence. Judges 1-1-3 tells us that after Joshua's death, the people asked, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites?" Notice they still believed in battle. They still believed in victory. But the question wasn't, "What does the Lord say?" It was, "Who will lead us?" The shift was subtle, but seismic. They were moving forward, but without seeking the face of the one who brought them here. And that's where the unraveling begins. Not with rebellion, but with assumption. Not with hatred of God, but with the slow drift of self-reliance. The land was flowing with milk and honey. Yes, but their souls were running dry, because peace without presence is just another kind of exile. And so they settled. They compromised. They made room for idols, for alliances, for silence where prayer used to live. They told themselves it was harmless. "We're just adapting," they might have said. "We're being practical." But the heart knows the difference between adaptation and abandonment. And God saw, not with fury, but with grief. For he had brought them out to bring them into a life of worship, not just land, into a rhythm of trust, not just territory. And now, they had the land, but lost the rhythm. Still, even in their slow fade, grace lingered. Because the God of judges is not waiting to strike, he is waiting to restore. And restoration always begins with a return. Not a perfect one, not a loud one, just a whisper in the dark. "Remember me." But for now, the night deepens, the stars watch, and the silence grows heavier. Because when a people forget who they are, the enemy doesn't need to fight, they just need to wait. And wait, he did. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand declaration, no tearing down of altars, no dramatic turning away. It began much more quietly, like mist rising off a river at dawn. So soft you hardly notice it's there, until the whole valley is swallowed in haze. One morning, a farmer passed a Canaanite shrine on his way to the field. and didn't flinch. The next week, his wife lit a small clay lamp before a carved figurine, just to be safe, just in case the storm came. After all, Baal was the god of rain, wasn't he? And hadn't the rains been late? It wasn't worship, they told themselves. It was just insurance, just a little hedge against uncertainty. And so the boundary blurred, not with violence, but with convenience. The children played near the sacred groves, their laughter mingling with the chants of strangers. The elders stopped correcting them. What harm could it do? After all, Yahweh was mighty, but maybe he didn't mind if they borrowed a little help from the local gods. That's how rebellion begins. Not in defiance, but in doubt. Not in hatred of God, but in the slow erosion of trust. You've felt this, haven't you? That subtle shift when you stop bringing your anxiety to prayer and start scrolling through your phone instead just to numb the fear, or when you justify a small compromise because everyone does it, or it's not that bad, or God understands. And maybe he does understand. But understanding isn't the same as approval. The Bible puts it plainly in Judges 2:11-13. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and followed other gods. Notice the language, not they attacked God, but they abandoned him. Like a child drifting from a parent's hand in a crowded market, not out of anger, but distraction. And what filled the space? Not emptiness, but idols. Not just carved wood and stone, but the gods of security, fertility, power, and comfort. The Canaanite gods promised immediate results: rain for your crops, strength for your sons, protection for your home. Yahweh asked for trust, and trust is harder than transaction. So they traded the unseen for the visible, the eternal for the urgent. And the heart, once tuned to the whisper of the Almighty, began to echo with lesser voices. You can almost hear the silence growing in their homes, the absence of morning prayers, the missing hymns at dusk, the quiet where the name of Yahweh used to be spoken with reverence. It wasn't that they stopped believing entirely. They just started believing in more than one thing. And when your faith becomes a buffet, taking what you like, leaving what's hard, you're no longer following a God. You're curating a spirituality. And curated spirituality doesn't save. It soothes. It numbs. It gives the illusion of peace while the soul starves. The tragedy is that they didn't even realize they were falling. To them, life felt normal, productive, safe, but spiritual decay is like termites in a beam. No one sees the damage until the floor collapses. And collapse was coming. Not because God was waiting to punish, but because sin always leads somewhere. Idols don't just sit on shelves. They demand loyalty. They isolate. They distort. They teach you to fear the wrong things and trust the wrong people. And soon, the people who once crossed the Red Sea on dry ground were bowing before statues made by human hands. Hands that could not save, eyes that could not see, mouths that could not speak. Yet they bowed, not out of conviction, but out of weariness, out of the quiet despair that says, if God is real, why does life still hurt so much? And in that moment of doubt, the enemy offered a shortcut, a false comfort, a quick fix, a God who asked for less and promised more. But the promise was a lie, because every idol is a mirror. It reflects back what we want, not what we need. And what Israel needed wasn't rain, it was remembrance. Not more gods, but the one who split the sea. But for now, the whisper had taken root. The rebellion had begun, and the stars above watched in sorrow as the people who once shouted, "The Lord has done great things for us," now whispered prayers to gods who could not hear. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was haunted. When the Bible says, "The anger of the Lord burned against Israel," Judges 2:14, it's easy to imagine thunder rolling across the sky, fire descending from heaven, or a divine fist slamming down in fury. But that's not the picture Judges paints. Here, God's anger doesn't sound like a roar. It sounds like a sigh. It doesn't feel like vengeance. It feels like grief. Because this isn't the rage of a tyrant whose pride has been wounded. It's the sorrow of a father whose children have wandered into danger and don't even know they're lost. You see, God didn't respond to their idolatry by smiting them instantly. He didn't erase them from the land he'd just given them. Instead, he did something far more painful. He stepped back. So, the Lord sold them into the hands of raiders. Judges 2:14. The word sold here isn't about cruelty, it's about consequence. Like a parent who, after countless warnings, finally lets a stubborn teenager experience the natural result of a bad choice, not to punish, but to awaken. Because sometimes, love must allow pain in order to restore purpose. The raiders came swift, merciless, stealing harvests, burning fields, taking children, and in that chaos, the people finally felt what they'd forgotten: their need, their vulnerability, their dependence. That's the strange tenderness in God's anger. It's corrective, not destructive. It's surgical, not spiteful. He didn't abandon them. He allowed them to bump into the hard edges of a world without his covering, so they would remember what it felt like to live without him. Think of a child who insists on walking alone in the dark, convinced they don't need your hand. You watch from the porch, heart pounding, knowing the thorns and holes ahead. When they stumble and cry out, you don't shout, "I told you so." You run, but sometimes you have to let them fall first, so they'll reach for you again. That's the posture of God in Judges. He withdraws his protective hedge, not because he stops caring, but because his love refuses to enable spiritual sleepwalking. He would rather they suffer temporarily than live forever numb. And this is where modern faith often gets God wrong. We've been taught to fear his anger as if it's explosive and unpredictable. But in the story of Judges, his anger is deeply relational. It's the response of a covenant-keeping God to covenant-breaking people. It's the ache of betrayal, yes, but also the hope of return. Notice this. Every time Israel was oppressed, the text says, they groaned under their oppression. Judges 2:18. Not a formal prayer, not a polished confession, just a groan. The raw, wordless sound of a soul pushed to its limit. And God heard it. Not because they'd cleaned up their act, not because they'd earned mercy, but because their suffering broke the silence between them. Their pain became a prayer, and his heart broke with them. This is the God of Judges, slow to anger, yes, but also unwilling to let his beloved stay in the mud. He disciplines, but he doesn't disown. He allows the storm, but he never leaves the boat. And when they cried even weakly, even selfishly, he raised up a deliverer, not because they deserved one, but because his love is stubborn. It refuses to let go. So if you've ever feared that God is furious with you for your doubts, your compromises, your quiet drift, hear this. His anger toward you is not the anger of a judge sentencing a criminal. It's the sorrow of a lover watching you choose shadows over light. And even in that sorrow, His hand is outstretched, waiting for the slightest turn of your heart. He doesn't need perfection, just honesty. He doesn't demand a grand repentance, just a whispered, "I miss you." And in the book of Judges, that whisper was always enough. Because God's anger was never the end of the story, it was always the beginning of rescue. So tonight, if you feel the weight of your own wanderings, if you've built your own little idols of control, distraction, or self-sufficiency, know this: God isn't waiting to strike, He's waiting to restore. And His strange, holy anger, it's just love with tears in its eyes, saying, "Come home, even now, even like this. Breathe." He's still listening. It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't a psalm. It wasn't even a full sentence. It was a sound raw, ragged, rising from the throat of a man hunched over his ruined field at midnight. A groan, a gasp, a single word choked out between sobs. Yahweh, that was enough. In the book of Judges, deliverance never begins with a hero's bold declaration. It begins with a cry. Again and again, the pattern is the same. They cried out to the Lord. Judges 3-9, 6-7, 10. Not because they were worthy, not because they had a plan, but because they had nothing left but the name of God on their lips. And even that was trembling. You can almost see him. A farmer whose grain was stolen, whose sons were taken, whose wife wept silently by the hearth. He doesn't quote scripture. He doesn't promise to change. He just falls to his knees in the dirt and whispers the name he hasn't spoken in years, Yahweh, as if testing whether it still holds power. And it does. Not because of his faith, but because of God's faithfulness. This is the quiet miracle of Judges. God listens before we clean ourselves up. He doesn't wait for perfect theology or a flawless apology. He leans in when the soul is cracked open not by devotion, but by desperation. And that's where grace meets us. Not in our strength, but in our collapse. Think of your own darkest nights. The ones where you couldn't even form a prayer, just to sob into your pillow. The nights you felt too ashamed to speak to God because you'd ignored Him for so long. But here's the truth. Your silence hasn't erased your standing. Your distance hasn't canceled your sonship. God isn't keeping score of your absences. He's counting your tears. And when you finally whisper, "I don't know if you're listening, but I'm out of options," that's the moment heaven bends low. The Bible says God could bear Israel's misery no longer. Judges 10:16. The Hebrew is tender. His heart was short, with grief for them like a parent whose love is so deep, their child's pain becomes their own. He didn't rescue them because they deserved it. He rescued them because He loved them too much to leave them in the pit. And that love is still alive tonight. Maybe you're crying out right now, not with your voice, but with your soul. Maybe your groan is the quiet resignation of chronic anxiety. Maybe it's the ache of a relationship crumbling. Maybe it's the shame of a habit you can't break. You don't have to explain it perfectly. You don't have to justify your pain. Just let it rise raw, unedited, messy, because God isn't repelled by your brokenness. He's drawn to it. Like a shepherd who leaves the 99 to find the one, He moves toward the sound of your whisper. And when He hears, He doesn't always send a miracle right away. Sometimes He sends a judge. Sometimes He sends time. But always, always, He sends Himself. Presence before provision. Nearness before solutions. That's the pattern. Cry. Then he raises up a deliverer, not because the people fixed themselves, but because their cry opened a door for grace to enter. So tonight, if you're lying awake with a heart too heavy to carry, don't try to fix it. Just let it be heard. Whisper his name, even if your voice shakes, even if you're not sure he's there. Because the God of judges is the God who hears the unspoken, who sees the tear you wiped away before anyone noticed, who counts your silent nights as prayers. And that cry you're afraid is too small, too late, too weak. It's the very sound that shakes the stars. Before the thunder of Deborah's song, before the fire of Gideon's torches, before the strength of Samson's arms, there was Othniel. Not a king, not a prophet, not even a warrior by trade. Just a young man, the nephew of Caleb, living in the shadow of giants. He didn't part seas or speak with fire. He didn't have an angel announce his birth or a nation waiting on his word. He was simply faithful. And in the chaos of Judges, that was enough. After Israel cried out under the oppression of Cushan-Rishathaim, a foreign king whose name means doubly wicked, God didn't send a storm. He didn't shake the earth. He simply raised up a deliverer. Judges 3-9. And his choice was Othniel, son of Kenaz, a man whose name means Lion of God. Though his life bore little resemblance to roaring, you won't find epic battle scenes written about him, no dramatic speeches, no miraculous signs. Just this quiet line: the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. Judges 3:10. And then he acted. No fanfare, no delay, just obedience, wrapped in humility. Imagine him, perhaps working the land, minding his family's vineyard, when the word came that the elders were calling. He didn't refuse. He didn't bargain. He didn't demand proof. He simply rose and led. And in that moment, the Spirit of God rested on him, not because he was extraordinary, but because he was available. That's the secret of Othniel. His greatness wasn't in his resume, it was in his readiness. In a time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes, he chose to do what was right in God's eyes, even when no one was watching. And God honored that. The battle was won. The land had rest. For 40 years, peace settled like morning dew over the hills of Ephraim. No invasions, no cries in the night. Just quiet faithfulness, season after season. And then, Othniel faded. No monument, no annual festival, no grand eulogy. He lived, he led, he died, and the text moves on. But heaven remembers, because in God's economy, the quiet servants are just as vital as the spotlight saints. Othniel didn't need fame to be faithful. He didn't need followers to be courageous. He simply showed up when his people needed him and let the Spirit do the rest. You may feel like your faith is unnoticed too. Maybe you're the one who shows up to pray when no one else does. The one who chooses kindness when bitterness would be easier. The one who stays steady while others chase the next spiritual high. You don't write books. You don't preach sermons. But you show up in your home, your workplace, your quiet corner of the world, and you do what's right, even when it costs you. That's Othniel courage. Not loud, not flashy, just true, and God sees it. In a world that celebrates the dramatic, he cherishes the dependable. In an age that glorifies the viral, he honors the consistent. Othniel's legacy wasn't in headlines, it was in 40 years of peace. Peace that allowed children to sleep without fear. Peace that let farmers plant without dread. Peace that gave a weary nation room to breathe. Sometimes, The greatest victory isn't the one shouted from rooftops, but the one whispered in the quiet faithfulness of an ordinary life. So if you've ever felt too small to matter, too quiet to be used, too ordinary to make a difference, remember Othniel, the first judge, the forgotten deliverer, the man who didn't need a spotlight to reflect God's light. He simply let the Spirit move through him, and the land was saved. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of heroism the world needs most right now. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that gives itself away in silence. Rest in that truth tonight. Your quiet faithfulness is not wasted. It's weaving peace into a broken world, one unseen act of courage at a time. Peace settled over the land like a warm blanket, soft, comforting, almost sacred. For 40 years, no raiders came. No alarms shattered the night. Children played in fields that once ran red with blood. Vineyards flourished. Markets buzzed. Laughter returned to hearths that had known only weeping. And in that safety, something else grew, something slower, quieter, more dangerous than any enemy: complacency. It began innocently enough. With full bellies, people stopped gathering to hear the elders recount the Exodus. With secure borders, they forgot to teach their children about the Red Sea. With quiet nights, they no longer lifted their eyes to the stars and whispered, "Yahweh, you are near." Peace, meant to be a gift, became a cage not of iron, but of indifference. Because when suffering ends, memory fades. And when memory fades, gratitude withers. The same people who once cried out in desperation now walked through their days without a single thought of the one who had delivered them. They weren't rebelling, not yet. They were just comfortable. And comfort, when left unchecked, breeds spiritual sleep. You know this rhythm, don't you? That season after a crisis passes, when the illness is healed, the debt is paid, the relationship is mended, and slowly, prayer becomes optional. Worship feels less urgent. The Bible gathers dust on the nightstand, not out of malice, but because life feels stable again. And stability, in the wrong hands, becomes a substitute for dependence. Israel didn't abandon God in a day. They simply stopped needing him. And that's the tragedy of peace without purpose. It lulls the soul into thinking it's self-sufficient. But the God of the Exodus is not a rescue tool to be stored away when the emergency ends. He is the constant companion, the daily bread, the living water even in the calm. Yet, in the stillness, they forgot. They kept the festivals. Yes, but the fire was gone. They spoke the name Yahweh, but without awe. They lived in the land, but as tenants, not sons. And so the cycle prepared to turn again. Not because God withdrew, but because they drifted. Judges doesn't say they were attacked immediately after Othniel died. It says, after Othniel, son of Kenaz, died, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Judges 3:12. The evil wasn't sudden violence. It was slow neglect, the kind that looks like normal life. Planting crops, raising families, tending flocks. But beneath the surface, the heart had grown cold. They assumed peace would last because they deserved it. But peace in Judges was never a reward. It was a reprieve, a grace-filled pause to remember, to recalibrate, to deepen trust. Instead, they used it to relax their grip on the giver. And the enemy watched. He didn't need to storm the gates. He just needed to wait for the watchman to fall asleep. Because the greatest threat to faith isn't persecution. It's prosperity without perspective. When you have everything you need, it's easy to believe you don't need God. But true peace isn't the absence of trouble, it's the presence of trust. And Israel had traded the latter for the former. So the land grew quiet, but the soul grew restless. Because a heart that forgets its source may rest, but it will never be satisfied. Tonight, as you lie in your own season of peace, whether it's financial stability, relational calm, or emotional relief, ask yourself, has my comfort made me complacent? Has my safety made me silent before God? Not to induce guilt, but to invite awareness. Because peace is a gift, but only when it leads us back to the giver. Otherwise, it becomes the prelude to another cry in the darkness. For now, though, breathe, rest. But don't forget to whisper, even in your calm, you are still my peace, O Lord, even when I have everything else. The stars are watching, and so is He. In a world that celebrates strength, speed, and stature, God often chooses the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones the world dismisses with a glance. And so it was with Ehud, a man whose greatest flaw became his greatest weapon. In ancient Israel, left-handedness wasn't just unusual, it was seen as a defect. The right hand symbolized power, honor, blessing. The left, awkwardness, weakness, even deceit. Children were trained to use their right hand, no matter their nature. To be left-handed was to carry a quiet stigma, a reminder that you didn't quite fit the mold. And yet, when Israel groaned under the heavy hand of Eglon, king of Moab, a ruler so obese, he sat in a private upper room like a bloated idol. It was not a mighty warrior God raised up, but a left-handed Benjaminite named Ehud. Not a general, not a prophet, just a man with a hidden dagger and a quiet resolve. The story unfolds like a shadow play. Israel, forced to pay tribute to their oppressor, sends a delegation led by Ehud to deliver the annual payment. But Ehud carries more than silver. Beneath his robe, strapped to his right thigh, where no right-handed guard would think to look, he hides a double-edged sword, 18 inches long. The irony is poetic. His weakness becomes his cover. Because in a world that assumes everyone is right-handed, no one watches the left side. And so Ehud walks alone into the king's chamber, dismissed as harmless, forgettable, a mere messenger. But he is more than that. He is a deliverer in disguise. When the room is empty, Ehud turns and says, "I have a secret message for you, O king." Judges 3:19. Eglon rises, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of pride, believing himself untouchable in his palace of luxury. And in that moment, Ehud reaches with his left hand, draws the blade, and plunges it deep into the king's belly. The fat closes over the hilt. No cry escapes. No alarm sounds. The king falls, silent, dead in his own arrogance, and Ehud slips away, locking the doors behind him, leaving the guards outside to assume their master was merely relieving himself. But don't mistake this for a tale of violence alone. At its heart, this is a story about divine ingenuity. God didn't need an army. He needed a man who knew how to use what he had, even if the world called it a weakness. Ehud didn't wield charisma or miracles. He wielded obedience, cunning, and the quiet courage to walk into the lion's den alone. And through him, God delivered Israel not with thunder, but with a whisper. You may feel overlooked too. Maybe you've been told you're not strong enough, smart enough, eloquent enough. Maybe your flaw, your sensitivity, your quiet nature, your past Your difference has been used against you. But hear this. What the world calls a weakness, God may call a weapon. Your uniqueness isn't a mistake. It's a strategy. Ehud didn't try to be right-handed. He leaned into who he was. And God used it to change a nation. And notice this. After Ehud's act, he didn't flee. He blew a trumpet in the hills of Ephraim and rallied the people. "Follow me," he cried, "for the Lord has given your enemies into your hands." Judges 3:27. His courage wasn't just in the strike, it was in the call. He didn't hoard the victory. He shared it. And the land had peace again 80 years this time. A long, quiet reign birthed from a single, daring act in a locked room. So tonight, if you feel small, if you feel unseen, if your story seems too ordinary to matter, remember Ehud, the left-handed whisperer, the man who walked where no one expected him to go, and did what no one thought possible, because he trusted that God could use even his wrong hand to write redemption. Beneath the shade of a palm tree in the hill country of Ephraim, a woman sat not in a palace, not on a throne, but in the open air, where anyone could find her. Her name was Deborah, and she was unlike any leader Israel had known. She didn't command armies from behind walls. She didn't speak in thunder. She simply listened to God, to the land, to the people who came to her with tangled hearts and broken disputes. And because she listened so well, they came from miles around. Farmers with boundary quarrels, widows with inheritance fears, mothers with wayward sons. They didn't call her judge as a title of power, but as a gift of trust. For in a time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes, Deborah was a living compass, pointing not to herself, but to the one who holds the stars. She wasn't chosen because she was loud. She was chosen because she was faithful. The Bible says simply, "Now Deborah, a prophetess, was leading Israel at that time." Judges 4:4. No explanation. No fanfare. Just a quiet statement of divine appointment. In a culture where women rarely held public authority, God raised her not to defy order, but to restore it. Not to prove a point, but to meet a need. And her leadership wasn't marked by domination, but by discernment. She didn't seize power. She stewarded peace. Under her palm tree, justice wasn't harsh. It was healing. Truth wasn't weaponized, it was woven with mercy. And in that space, Israel began to remember what it meant to live under the rule of God again. But her wisdom wasn't passive. When the Canaanite general Sisera gathered his 900 iron chariots and pressed down on the tribes like a storm cloud, Deborah didn't hide. She sent for Barak, the military leader, and delivered a word from the Lord. "Go, I will lure Sisera to the Kishon River, and I will give him into your hands." Judges 4-7. Notice she didn't say, "I will give him into my hands." She didn't need the glory. She only needed obedience. And when Barak hesitated, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go," she agreed. Though she warned him the honor of victory would go not to him, but to a woman. Not out of pride, but prophecy. For God delights in overturning human expectations. And so Deborah rose not as a soldier, but as a shepherd. She walked with Barak to the battlefield, not to fight, but to stand, to remind him and all of Israel that the battle belonged to the Lord. And when the rains came, swelling the Kishon River into a torrent, the mighty chariots sank in the mud. Sisera fled on foot, only to meet his end, not by a warrior's sword, but by the tent peg of Jael, a foreign woman whose courage matched Deborah's faith. Later, Deborah sang, not a song of war, but of remembrance. When the princes in Israel take the lead, bless the Lord. Judges 5-2. Her song, ancient, poetic, fierce, celebrated not just victory, but divine faithfulness. She named the tribes who showed up and those who stayed home. She honored the ordinary, the village wells, the stars in the sky, the courage of women. Her song was theology, sung truth wrapped in melody, passed down not in scrolls, but in lullabies. You, too, may be called to lead, not from a stage, but from a tree, not with noise, but with presence. Maybe your palm tree is your kitchen table, your office desk, your hospital room. Maybe your authority isn't in a title, but in your consistency, your listening ear, your refusal to let fear dictate your choices. Deborah didn't wait for permission to be wise. She simply opened her heart to God and let His voice flow through her. And so tonight, as you rest beneath your own sky, remember, wisdom doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers from the shade of a tree, calling a weary world back to justice, back to courage, back to God. He was a warrior by name, but not yet by heart. Barak stood among the tribes of Israel as a man of strength, trained in the ways of battle, known in the villages of Naphtali. Yet when Deborah summoned him and spoke the word of the Lord, "Go, gather your men, I will give Sisera into your hands," his reply was not a battle cry, but a condition. If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. Judges 4-8. There it is, raw, human, trembling beneath the surface of duty. Not outright refusal, but hesitant dependence. Not cowardice, but fear cloaked in caution. He believed God's promise, but only if Deborah walked beside him. And far from rebuking him, God honored his honesty. Deborah didn't scold. She didn't shame. She simply said, "I will go with you. But because of the way you are doing this, the honor will not be yours. The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." Judges 4-9. Not as punishment, but as redirection. Because God doesn't discard the fearful. He redeems them. Barak's story is a gift to every one of us who has ever said, "I'll follow, but only if someone walks with me." Maybe it's your pastor, your friend, your mentor, your spouse. Maybe it's a podcast voice in the night, a scripture verse underlined in red, a memory of your grandmother's prayer. You believe, but your knees shake. You're willing, but your courage needs company. And that's okay. God isn't looking for fearless heroes. He's looking for faithful followers, even if they walk with trembling hands. Barak didn't pretend he was ready. He named his limitation, and in that humility, God met him. Deborah didn't take over. She didn't lead the charge. She walked with him, prophet beside soldier, wisdom beside warfare. And in that partnership, heaven moved. Notice what Barak didn't do. He didn't stay home. He didn't argue. He didn't demand more signs. He simply said, "I need you with me." And that was enough to launch a deliverance. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is admit we're not strong enough alone. In a world that glorifies solo success, Barak reminds us that divine work is often done in pairs, in community, in trust, in shared dependence on God. His fear didn't disqualify him. It made room for grace. And though the honor of Sisera's defeat went to Jael, Barak still stood on the battlefield. He still led 10,000 men. He still became part of the song of victory. His name is remembered not as the one who struck the final blow, but as the one who showed up, afraid but faithful. And Deborah? She didn't lord her authority over him. She didn't say, "Fine, I'll do it myself." She said, "I will go." Her leadership wasn't about control, it was about stewardship. She carried the word of the Lord, not to elevate herself, but to equip another. In a time of chaos, she didn't hoard power. She shared presence. That's true spiritual leadership. Not standing above, but walking beside. Not demanding obedience, but offering courage. So, if you're listening tonight and your heart whispers, "I'm not ready," or "What if I fail?" hear this. God doesn't need your perfection. He needs your participation. Like Barak, you can say, "I'll go, but I need you with me." And he will say, as he did through Deborah, "I am with you." Your fear doesn't cancel your calling. It qualifies you for grace. After the chaos of battle, there is always silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, trembling quiet that follows violence. The kind that settles like dust over a battlefield. And in that silence, in the shadow of Mount Tabor, a woman stood holding a hammer and a tent peg. Her name was Jael, a Kenite, not an Israelite, not a warrior, just a woman whose husband was at peace with King Jabin of Canaan. And yet, when the Canaanite general Sisera fled the battlefield on foot, exhausted, terrified, covered in the mud of divine defeat, he ran not to his fortress, but to her tent. Why? Perhaps because he knew her people were neutral. Perhaps because he saw kindness in her eyes. Or perhaps because, in his desperation, he mistook gentleness for weakness. She welcomed him, gave him milk instead of water, a richer drink, a sign of honor, covered him with a blanket, said, "Don't be afraid," Judges 4:18. And as he sank into exhausted sleep, his breathing deep and heavy, she did what no one expected. She took a tent peg, the same kind used to secure the fabric of her home, and drove it through his temple, pinning his head to the ground. The Bible says, he died. Judges 4:21. 3 words, no fanfare, no battle cry, just the quiet, brutal end of a tyrant who had oppressed Israel for 20 years. But don't rush past this moment. Don't reduce Jael to a symbol of violence or vengeance. Look closer. See the weight of her choice. She was not an Israelite. She owed them nothing. She risked everything: her life, her family, her safety, by betraying a powerful enemy who had sought refuge in her tent, a sacred space of hospitality. In ancient Near Eastern culture, to harm a guest was unthinkable. Yet she chose loyalty to a God she may not have fully known, over the rules of political neutrality. She saw not just a general, but the source of endless suffering. Mothers weeping for sons taken to war, fields burned, villages silenced. And in one decisive act, she broke the chain of oppression. Deborah later sang of her, "Most blessed of women be Jael, who killed Sisera. He sank, he fell, he lay still at her feet." Judges 5:24-27. Not with shame, but with honor. Because sometimes, deliverance wears the face of a woman who dares to act when the world expects her to stay silent. Jael didn't wield a sword. She used the tools of her daily life, a peg, a hammer, and turned them into instruments of justice. That's the quiet power of ordinary people in extraordinary moments. They use what they have, where they are, to tip the scales toward righteousness. And then came the silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the weight of what she had done. She stood over the body of a man she had just fed, just covered, just calmed. There was no joy in her eyes, only resolve. No celebration, just the quiet courage of someone who knew evil must sometimes be stopped, even at great personal cost. You may never face such a moment, but you, too, have been given tools, your voice, your home, your choices. And there are times when kindness must be paired with courage, when hospitality must not become complicity, when saying no to injustice is the deepest form of love. Jael's story isn't about violence, it's about discernment. About the moment a woman looked at a powerful man and saw not a guest, but a predator, and chose the side of the suffering. Tonight, as you rest, remember, you don't need a sword to be brave. Sometimes, all it takes is a tent peg and the will to drive it home. And then, like Jael, you return to silence. Not guilt, not shame, but the quiet peace of one who did what had to be done. Breathe. The night is safe now. Long after the battle ended, long after the chariots sank in the mud, and Sisera fell silent in Jael's tent, someone began to sing. Not a soldier, not a king. A prophetess named Deborah, sitting beneath her palm tree, her voice rising like incense into the night sky. And in that song, ancient, wild, and full of wonder, she wrote words that still shimmer like starlight. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera. Judges 5:20. Not armies, not weapons. The stars themselves, the very lights God placed in the sky to mark seasons, to guide wanderers, to declare His glory, they became witnesses, even participants, in the deliverance of His people. Can you imagine it? The night of the battle was not just dark earth and clashing steel. Above it all, the heavens leaned in. Orion stood watch. The Pleiades held their breath. The Milky Way poured light like a river over the Kishon Valley. And as the rain began to fall, swelling the river, trapping the iron chariots in the mud, it was as if creation itself rose to defend the covenant. This wasn't mere poetry. It was truth sung. Because in the biblical imagination, the cosmos is never neutral. When God moves on earth, the heavens respond. The same stars that watched Abraham count his descendants now watched Israel rise from oppression. The same sky that held back the sun for Joshua now sent storms to drown the enemy's might. Nature doesn't rebel against its maker. It aligns with His purposes. And that night, the stars didn't just shine. They fought, not with fire or fury, but with faithful presence, marking the hour, illuminating the path, bearing silent testimony that heaven was not asleep. You're lying under those same stars tonight. Look up. Even if clouds hide them, they're there, steady, ancient, singing the same song. God sees, God acts, God delivers. Your struggle may feel small in the vastness of the universe, but to the one who named every star, your cry is just as significant as Israel's. He who commands the galaxies also counts your tears. And if He called on the stars to fight for a broken people long ago, how much more will He move on your behalf now? Deborah's song doesn't end with war. It ends with rest. So may all your enemies perish, Lord, but may all who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength. Judges 5:31. Not like swords, not like storms, like the sun, gentle, life-giving, unstoppable in its daily return. That's the vision. Not endless battle, but dawn after darkness. Not chaos, but order restored. And for 80 years after that night, the land knew peace. Children were born who never heard the sound of chariots. Farmers planted without fear. Mothers sang lullabies under open skies. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine those stars above you, not cold and distant, but warm with divine attention. Each one a reminder, you are not alone in your fight. The same God who stirred the heavens for Deborah still watches over you. Your deliverance may not come with thunder, but it is coming. And when it does, you'll look back and say, even the stars were with me. Breathe deeply. Let the night hold you. The stars are still singing, and you are safe beneath them. He wasn't on a hilltop shouting courage to the masses. He wasn't training warriors in the open field. He was at the bottom of a wine press, deep, narrow, hidden, beating out wheat with trembling hands, glancing over his shoulder with every stroke. The Midianites were coming again. They always came at harvest time, like locusts with swords, devouring everything Israel had sown. And so Gideon worked in secret, ashamed of his fear, ashamed of his weakness, ashamed that the son of Joash, a man of Manasseh, was reduced to hiding like a thief in his own land. He believed God had abandoned them. Who could blame him? For 7 years, the enemy had stripped them bare. No grain in the barns, no oil in the jars, just dust, despair, and the echo of hooves in the distance. And now, even this small act of survival, threshing a handful of wheat, felt like rebellion. But God saw him there, not in the temple, not on the battlefield, in the pit. And he didn't send an army. He sent an angel, not with thunder, but with a whisper. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Judges 6:12. Imagine the irony. Standing in a hole in the ground, covered in chaff, heart pounding at every rustle in the brush, and called mighty. Gideon didn't flinch with pride. He flinched with confusion. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened? He replied. Judges 6:13. Not doubt as defiance, but doubt as devotion. He still believed enough to ask. He still cared enough to wonder. And that was the crack through which grace entered. You know what it's like to feel small in your calling, to believe you're meant for something, but see only lack, failure, fear. Maybe you're working a job that drains you, raising children in a world that frightens you, praying prayers that seem to hit the ceiling. Like Gideon, you might be hiding not from God, but from your own disappointment in yourself. You've tried before. You've failed before. And now, you thresh your dreams in secret, hoping no one notices how little you have to show for it. But God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called, even if they're crouching in a wine press. He didn't rebuke Gideon for his fear. He met him in it. He didn't demand confidence. He offered covenant. I will be with you, he said, and you will strike down all the Midianites. Judges 6:16. Not because Gideon was strong, but because God was faithful. And that promise was enough to make a trembling man stand slowly, shakily. But he stood. Notice how Gideon responded. Not with a battle plan, but with an altar. He tore down his father's altar to Baal that night, not in bold defiance, but under the cover of darkness, with 10 servants beside him. Even his first act of faith was quiet, cautious, human. He didn't suddenly become fearless. He just took one step, then another, while his knees shook, and God honored everyone. This is the Gideon we need today. Not the polished hero of Sunday school flannel graphs, but the real man, afraid, questioning, yet willing to obey in the dark. His story isn't about perfection. It's about presence. God didn't need Gideon's strength. He only needed his surrender. So if you're hiding tonight in your room, in your worries, in the winepress of your circumstances, hear this. God sees you, and he's not calling you mighty because of what you've done. He's calling you mighty because of what he will do through you. Rest now. Even in the pit, you are seen. Even in the fear, you are called. And the one who met Gideon in the winepress is kneeling beside you now. He had heard the voice. He had seen the fire consume the offering. He had even torn down his father's altar in the dead of night. And still, he wasn't sure. Gideon stood in the field at dawn, holding a wool fleece in his hands, his heart pounding like a trapped bird. If you are really going to use me, he whispered to the one who called him mighty warrior, let this fleece be wet with dew tomorrow while the ground stays dry. And if it's dry while the ground is wet, then I'll know it's you. 2 tests, 2 chances for God to say, yes, I'm real. Yes, I'm with you. And God said, yes, not with impatience, but with astonishing tenderness. We often call this Gideon's lack of faith, as if his doubt disqualified him. But what if it was actually his honesty that made him usable? In a world that demands bold declarations, I believe, I trust, I have no fear, Gideon dared to say, I want to believe, but I need help. And instead of scolding him, God met him in the dew. Not once, but twice. Because sometimes faith isn't a leap in the dark. It's a series of small, trembling steps, each one confirmed by grace. You may feel guilty for needing signs too. Maybe you've prayed the same prayer for years and still wonder, is God really listening? Maybe you've made a decision about a job, a relationship, a calling, and your heart races with uncertainty. You've read the promises, but your hands still shake, and you wonder, does God think I'm weak for needing proof? But look at Gideon. He wasn't condemned for his fleece. He was commissioned despite it. God didn't say, you should have known better. He said, I'll meet you where you are. That's the scandal of grace. It doesn't require perfect trust. It grows trust through faithful response. God knew Gideon's heart wasn't hardened in unbelief. It was soft in desperation. And a soft heart, even when trembling, is fertile ground for miracles. Notice, too, that Gideon didn't ask for a spectacle. He didn't demand fire from heaven or armies in the clouds. He asked for something ordinary, a fleece, dew, dry ground things that happen every morning. He wasn't seeking magic. He was seeking confirmation. And God honored that by working through the natural to reveal the divine. Your fleece might not be wool on the ground. It might be a quiet peace in chaos, a timely word from a friend, a door opening when all others closed, a scripture that seems to leap off the page just for you. These aren't less spiritual. They're more human. And God loves meeting us in our humanity. But there's a warning here too. The fleece was a starting point, not a lifestyle. Gideon asked once, then again. After that, he had to walk by faith, not by signs, because dependence on proof can become a prison. True faith eventually learns to trust the character of God, even when the evidence is hidden. But God gives us grace for the journey from the fleece to the battlefield. So if you're lying awake tonight, heart heavy with uncertainty, take courage. It's okay to ask for a sign if your heart is still open to obey. God isn't offended by your questions. He's near in your searching. And like the dew on Gideon's fleece, his faithfulness is fresh every morning. The camp stretched for miles. 135,000 Midianite soldiers, their tents glowing with oil lamps, their laughter rising like smoke into the night sky. Horses stamped, swords clinked, drums pulsed like a restless heart, and on the ridge above, 32,000 Israelite men stood ready to fight. But God looked at their numbers and said, "You have too many." Judges 7-2. Not because he needed fewer soldiers, he needed purer trust. So he thinned the ranks. First, he sent home anyone who was afraid. 22,000 walked away, their sandals whispering through the dust. Then he watched how the remaining 10,000 drank water at the stream. Those who knelt like dogs, sent home. Only 300 remained. The ones who scooped water to their lips with their hands, eyes still scanning the horizon, alert even in thirst. Not the strongest, not the bravest, just the most aware. And to them, God gave no weapons, no swords, no shields, only clay jars, torches, and trumpets. Imagine it. 300 men standing on the edge of a cliff, each holding a fragile pot, a flickering flame hidden inside, a ram's horn at their lips. No armor, no plan beyond obedience, just a whisper from Gideon, "Watch me, do what I do," and then silence, the kind that comes before a storm, the kind that makes your breath catch. At midnight, they moved like shadows down the slope. No battle cry, no charge, just the soft crunch of feet on stone. And when they reached the edge of the enemy camp, Gideon gave the signal. In one motion, 300 jars shattered, 300 torches blazed into the darkness, 300 trumpets blasted a single piercing note, and from every ridge, the Israelites shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Chaos erupted. The Midianites, startled from sleep, saw fire on every side, heard trumpets in every direction, and assumed the hills were swarming with armies. In their panic, they turned on each other. Friend struck friend. Horses reared. Tents collapsed. And without a single Israelite raising a blade, the enemy destroyed itself. It wasn't war, it was unraveling. Divine strategy, wrapped in silence, light, and sound. But don't miss the deeper truth. God didn't just win a battle. He rewrote the definition of strength. In a world that equates power with numbers, noise, and force, he chose fragility clay jars that break with one touch. He chose hidden light torches concealed until the right moment. He chose ordinary tools, trumpets, used for worship, not war. And he chose a night so still that one shout could echo like an army. You may feel like one of the 300 today, small, fragile, unsure. Maybe you've been reduced by life, failure, loss, rejection. Maybe you've been told you're not enough, too few, too weak, too quiet. But God often does his greatest work through what the world discards. Your jar might be your vulnerability. Your torch might be your testimony. Your trumpet might be your voice, soft but true. And when he says, "Break open," it's not to destroy you. It's to reveal the light you've been carrying all along. That night, Israel didn't win by fighting. They won by obeying, by trusting that God's way, strange, silent, and small, was enough. And as the enemy fled in the dawn, Gideon and his 300 stood not in triumph, but in awe. So tonight, as you rest in your own darkness, remember, you don't need an army. You don't need armor. You just need a jar, a torch, and the courage to shatter when he says, "Now." After the victory, after the shouting faded and the torches burned out, Gideon returned home not to a palace, but to his village in Ophrah. The people, awed by what God had done through him, said, "Rule over us, you, your son, your grandson for you, have saved us from Midian." Judges 8:22. But Gideon, still humble, still remembering the winepress, refused. "The Lord will rule over you," he said. And for a moment, it seemed wisdom had won. But then, he asked for something strange. "Give me the gold earrings from your plunder," he said, not for himself, not at first, but to make an ephod, a sacred garment like the one worn by the high priest in the tabernacle, a memorial, a reminder, a way to say, this was God's doing. He meant well, but good intentions are not enough to guard the heart. The gold poured in 1,700 shekels, more than a king's ransom, and from it, Gideon crafted not just a garment, but a golden object, perhaps a breastplate, perhaps a statue. The Bible doesn't say exactly, but it does say what happened next. It became a snare to Gideon and his family, and all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it. Judges 8:27. The very thing meant to point to God became a substitute for him. The memorial became a magnet for idolatry. The reminder became a rival. How does this happen? So quietly, so naturally. We take something holy, a ritual, a song, a leader, a vision, and we begin to cling to the symbol more than the source. Gideon didn't set out to make an idol. He wanted to honor God. But in his hands, the ephod became a focal point. People came to it, not to the altar in Shiloh. They sought him, not the Lord. And slowly, the line blurred. Worship shifted from the unseen God to the visible object, from faith to fascination. You've seen this in your own life, haven't you? The prayer journal that became a performance. The worship playlist that numbs rather than nourishes. The ministry that started in surrender, but now runs on ego. The Bible app opened not to seek God, but to check a box. Even good things, when they become central, can become idols. Because an idol isn't always a statue. Sometimes, it's the thing you believe must happen for God to be good. The relationship that must be restored. The dream that must come true. The leader you've placed your hope in. When that thing becomes your anchor, more than God himself, it has become your ephod. Gideon's tragedy wasn't his failure in battle. It was his success in peace. In the quiet after victory, he forgot that the greatest danger isn't the enemy outside, but the compromise within. And Israel, so quick to forget, so hungry for visible signs, bowed not to Yahweh, but to a golden garment made by human hands. The same people who had just seen God rout an army with 30 hours of silence now fixated on a piece of gold. But here's the grace in the warning. God doesn't abandon us when we stumble into well-meaning idolatry. He grieves. He waits. He calls us back. The story doesn't end with the ephod, it ends with Gideon's death and the land having rest 40 years. Even in failure, there was fruit. Even in compromise, there was grace. So tonight, as you rest, gently ask, what have I made into my ephod? What good thing am I holding so tightly that I've forgotten the giver? You don't need a golden object to remember God. You only need a surrendered heart. Let go. The true memorial isn't made of gold. It's written in the quiet trust of a soul that says, you alone are enough. After Gideon's death, Silence should have settled over Israel 40 years of peace. After all, was a rare gift in the days of judges. But peace is fragile when pride takes root. Gideon had many sons, 70, the text says, and among them was Abimelech, born not to an Israelite wife, but to a concubine from Shechem. Perhaps he always felt like an outsider. Perhaps he watched his brothers inherit honor while he inherited obscurity. Whatever the wound, it festered into hunger, not for justice, but for power. And so he went to his mother's kinsmen in Shechem and whispered a dangerous idea. Which is better for you, to be ruled by all 70 of Gideon's sons, or by one man younger, closer, one of your own? Judges 9-2. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, appealing to tribal loyalty, to convenience, to the human craving for simplicity. And they listened. They gave him 70 pieces of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, the very place where Israel had turned from Yahweh, and with that blood money, Abimelech hired reckless men. Then he went home, and in one terrible day, he murdered his brothers. All 70, their bodies left in a heap, at a single stone. Only one escaped, Jotham, the youngest, who hid and later climbed Mount Gerizim to speak a parable that still echoes through time. Once the trees went to anoint a king, Judges 9-8. The olive tree refused. The fig tree declined. The vine said, no. Only the thorn bush said yes and warned, if you truly want me as king, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, may fire come out of the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon. A thorn bush cannot shade. It only pricks, and its fire destroys even the mighty. Abimelech reigned not as a judge, not as a deliverer, but as a tyrant. And for 3 years, Shechem lived under his shadow. But betrayal begets betrayal. The very men who crowned him turned against him. Guilt, fear, and greed twisted their hearts. And when Abimelech crushed their rebellion with brutal force, burning a tower full of civilians alive, the curse of Jotham's parable began to unfold. The end came quietly, almost poetically. During the siege of Thebes, a woman dropped an upper millstone on Abimelech's head from a tower. Mortally wounded, he begged his armor-bearer to kill him with a sword, so that it will not be said, a woman killed me. Judges 9:54. Even in death, his pride spoke louder than his pain, and so his servant ran him through, and the man who sought a crown died in disgrace, buried under a curse, remembered not for deliverance, but for destruction. This story isn't just about one man's evil. It's a warning about what happens when leadership is driven by ego instead of calling, by lineage instead of character, by force instead of faith. Abimelech didn't ask, does God want me to lead? He asked, how can I get what I want? And in that question, he became the thorn bush, offering no shade, only pain. You may never seek a throne, but you've felt the pull of ambition, the desire to be seen, to be chosen, to prove your worth. And there's nothing wrong with influence, unless it becomes your God, because power without purpose is a hollow crown. Success without integrity is a slow poison, and legacy built on the backs of others is a house on sand. Tonight, as you rest, let Abimelech's story be a gentle warning. Don't trade your soul for a seat at a table that won't satisfy. Don't let old wounds justify new wounds. And never forget, true greatness isn't measured in followers, but in faithfulness. The stars above Shechem that night saw it all, the blood, the fire, the falling stone, and they wept. But even in this darkness, grace lingers. God did not raise up Abimelech. He allowed him and then removed him. because no tyrant reigns forever, and no thorn bush can stop the dawn. He was born on the wrong side of respectability, the son of a prostitute, rejected by his own half-brothers, driven from his father's house, with nothing but his name, Jephthah, which means God opens. How bitterly ironic that must have felt. Cast out, labeled unworthy, he gathered other outcasts around him, a band of worthless men. The Bible says, Judges 11-3, and lived on the edges of Gilead, far from the temples, far from the promises, far from belonging. And yet, when the Ammonites rose up and Israel had no one left to turn to, they came crawling to the man they had once called trash. Be our commander, they begged. Fight for us. Not because they loved him, because they needed him. And Jephthah, wounded but wise, made them swear an oath. If he won, he would rule over them. Not out of pride, but out of the hard-won knowledge that people only value what they covenant to uphold. Before the battle, he did what many faithful have done. He made a vow. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, he prayed to the Lord, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Judges 11:30-31. We recoil at those words now, but in his world, vows were sacred, and Jephthah, so long denied honor, wanted to give God the very best. He likely expected a servant, a goat, perhaps a prized bull. He never imagined it would be his only child, his daughter running out with timbrels and joy to greet her father, the hero. The text says he tore his clothes and cried, "You have brought me very low, for I have given my word to the Lord." Judges 11:35. Not anger, grief, the kind that hollows a man out. And she, his daughter, unnamed but unforgettable, did not rage. She did not beg. She said only, "Do to me what you have vowed, but let me go to the mountains for 2 months to mourn my virginity with my friends." Not her death, her virginity, her future, the life she would never live. No marriage, no children, no legacy. In that moment, she became the silent sacrifice of a broken system, of a father's well-intentioned but reckless faith. Some say he didn't kill her, that devoted to the Lord meant she lived as a consecrated virgin, never marrying, serving in perpetual worship. The Hebrew is ambiguous. But either way, joy turned to lament. A daughter's laughter was replaced by weeping on the mountains. And Israel remembered. Each year, the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate Jephthah's daughter. Judges 11:40. Not to celebrate victory, but to mourn what was lost in the name of faith. Jephthah's story is not one of heroism, but of heartbreak. He was a man shaped by rejection, desperate to prove his worth, so eager to please God that he spoke before thinking. His vow came not from malice, but from a deep, aching need to be seen as a leader, as a son, as someone whose offering mattered. And in that desperation, he bound himself and his child to a promise that brought sorrow, not sacrifice. You may carry your own heavy vows tonight. Promises made in pain. God, if you do this, I'll do that. Bargains struck in hospital rooms, in divorce courts, in midnight prayers. And now you wonder, did I promise too much? Can I go back? Hear this. God is not a cosmic deal, maker waiting to collect payment. He is a father who sees your heart. He honors your desire to give your best, but he never wanted your child, your joy, your future as a price. Jephthah was used by God. He delivered Israel. His name is even listed in Hebrews 11 among the heroes of faith. And yet, his story ends in tears. Because faith without wisdom can wound. Zeal without knowledge can destroy. And sometimes, the cost of our devotion is paid by those we love most. So tonight, let this story soften you. Don't make rash vows in your pain. Bring your desperation to God, but leave the terms to Him. He doesn't need your sacrifice. He wants your surrender. And if you've already spoken words you regret, know this: grace is greater than your vow. Mercy covers even the promises we wish we could take back. She ran out of the house with timbrels in her hands and joy in her steps barefoot. Maybe, hair flying, eyes bright with pride. Her father was home. Not just home, but victorious. The outcast had become a deliverer. The rejected had been raised to ruler, and she his only child. His delight rushed to meet him as daughters do, with music and laughter, with the unguarded love that believes the world is safe because he is back. She didn't know about the vow. She didn't hear the words he whispered in the desperation of battle. She only knew her father's face, and she ran toward it like sunlight. And then she saw it, the way his face fell, the way his hands trembled, the way his voice broke as he said, "You have brought me very low, for I have opened my mouth to the Lord." Judges 11:35. In that moment, her joy didn't turn to anger. It turned to understanding. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply said, "Do to me what you have vowed, since the Lord has avenged you of your enemies." Judges 11:36. Not resignation, not despair, but a heartbreaking alignment of her will with her father's faith, and she believed with God's plan. She asked for only one thing: "Let me go away for 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." Judges 11:37. Notice she didn't say, "Because I will die." She said, "Because I will never marry." In her culture, marriage wasn't just romance. It was legacy, identity, continuity. To remain unmarried was to vanish from the story. No children to carry her name. No hearth to call her own. Just silence, where her life should have sung. And so she went to the mountains, not to hide, but to grieve the future that would never be. For 2 months, the hills echoed with the weeping of young women, her friends, her companions, the ones who knew her laughter, her dreams, her quiet strength. They mourned not just her fate, but the injustice of it. A life cut short, not by war, not by sickness, but by a promise made in haste. And when she returned, the text says nothing of the moment. No description, no outcry, just silence, as if the story itself couldn't bear to witness what came next. But Israel remembered. Each year, the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate Jephthah's daughter. Judges 11:40. Not with feasts, not with triumph, with lament. A sacred pause in the calendar. A space to honor the cost of zeal without wisdom. The price paid by the innocent. The quiet courage of a girl who said yes when she could have said no. You may never face such a sacrifice, but you know what it means to lose a future you once imagined. The dream that didn't come true. The relationship that ended. The child you never held. The vocation that slipped away. And in those losses, you've wept, not just for what was taken, but for what will never be. Jephthah's daughter teaches us that surrender isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a young woman walking into the hills with her friends, letting her tears water the earth. and still choosing to trust, even when trust costs everything. She didn't write psalms. She didn't lead armies. She simply loved her father enough to bear his broken vow. And in that love, she became a mirror of a greater surrender, one that would come centuries later, when another would say, "Not my will, but yours." So tonight, as you rest, honor her, the unnamed one, the dancer who disappeared, the daughter who chose love over rage. And if your own heart is heavy with lost tomorrows, know this: your grief is holy, your tears are remembered, and the God who saw her on the mountains, it began not with swords, but with words. After Jephthah defeated the Ammonites, the men of Ephraim, proud, powerful, long accustomed to leading, came storming to him, furious. "Why did you go to fight the Ammonites without calling us?" they demanded. Judges 12-1. Not because they wanted to help, not because they cared about the outcome, but because they felt slighted. Their honor was bruised, their place in the story diminished. In their eyes, no victory was complete unless they had a part in it. And so their wounded pride turned to rage, and their rage turned to threat. "We're going to burn your house down with you in it." Jephthah, the outcast turned deliverer, tried reason. He reminded them, "I called you, but you didn't save me." He spoke of desperation, of battle, of God's hand. But pride doesn't listen to logic. It only hears its own echo. And so, war broke out, not against a foreign enemy, but between Israelites. Brother against brother, tribe against tribe. The very people who should have stood together now stood with swords drawn, all because someone felt unseen. When Jephthah defeated Ephraim, the survivors fled toward the Jordan River, hoping to escape. But Gilead's men guarded the fords, and there, in the dim light of aftermath, they devised a test. To cross, every fugitive had to say one word: Shibboleth. It seems harmless, a simple word, meaning ear of grain, a symbol of harvest, of provision. But in the dialect of Ephraim, the sh sound didn't exist. So when they tried to say Shibboleth, it came out Sibboleth. And that small difference, just a shift of the tongue, became a death sentence. Thousands were killed. Not for treason, not for violence, but for the way they spoke, for an accent, for a birthright they couldn't change. How easily division takes root, not in grand betrayals, but in petty slights, not in doctrine, but in tone, not in truth, but in tribal identity. Ephraim didn't care that Israel was free. They cared that they weren't credited. And in that moment, unity shattered not over God, not over justice, but over ego. You've seen this in our world too. The way language divides us. Politics, theology, even pronunciation. The way we judge others by their accent, their vocabulary, their social media post. The way we say, if you were really one of us, you'd think like us, talk like us, act like us. And when they don't, we exile them, not with swords, perhaps, but with silence, with suspicion, with a cold shoulder that says, "You don't belong." The tragedy of Shibboleth isn't just the bloodshed, it's the waste. These were brothers, same God, same story, same ancestors. Yet a single syllable became a wall no river could wash away. Tonight as you rest, ask gently, where have I made Shibboleth tests for others? Whose accent of faith have I rejected because it didn't sound like mine? Whose victory have I resented because I wasn't in the picture? True unity doesn't demand uniformity. It makes space for difference and still calls it family. The Jordan flows on. The harvests still come. But the word shibboleth lingers not as a test of loyalty, but as a warning. Pride turns language into a weapon. Humility turns strangers into siblings. So breathe. Let go of the need to be first. Let go of the scorekeeping. And may your words tonight, even in silence, be ones of grace. After the drama of Jephthah and the bloodshed of Shibboleth, the story could have spiraled into chaos, but it didn't. Instead, the Bible slips into a quiet rhythm, like a deep breath after a storm. After him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. Judges 12-8. No fanfare, no battle cries, just a name, a place, and a number. 30 sons and 30 daughters, married wisely, ruling for 7 years. Then Elon, the Zebulunite, judged Israel 10 years, Judges 12:11. And after him, Abdon, son of Hillel, ruled 8 years, Judges 12:13. 30 sons, 40 sons, 60 donkeys, details so ordinary they almost feel out of place in a book of miracles and mayhem. Why include them at all? Why pause the epic to mention men who left no songs, no monuments, no dramatic deliverances? Because their very obscurity is the point. In a narrative crowded with giants and tragedies, God makes space for the steady, the faithful who led without spectacle, the fathers who raised families in peace, the leaders who governed with wisdom, not warfare. Their legacy wasn't written in fire, but in fields well tended, marriages wisely arranged, communities stabilized. Ibzan, from Bethlehem, the same town that would one day cradle a king, sent his children into alliances not for power, but for peace. Elon, from Zebulun, a coastal tribe near the sea, perhaps brought calm to trade routes and fishing villages. Abdon, riding 60 donkeys, a sign of wealth, yes, but also of generosity, for donkeys carried the poor, may have used his resources to lift others. They didn't face Midianite hordes or Ammonite armies. Their enemy was entropy, the slow drift into disorder, and they fought it with presence, not panic. We live in an age that only remembers the loud, the viral, the controversial, the extraordinary. But most of life is lived in the margins, in school drop-offs, grocery lines, hospital vigils, quiet prayers at dawn, and God honors that. He doesn't only call the Deborahs and Samsons. He also calls the Ibzans, the ones who show up, day after day, doing the next right thing without needing a spotlight. You may feel forgotten too. Maybe your work isn't celebrated. Your name isn't known. Your faithfulness looks small. Packing lunches, paying bills, forgiving again, showing up when no one notices. But heaven keeps a different ledger. The God who noted how many donkeys Abdon owned also notes your silent sacrifices. He sees the extra hour you gave, the harsh word you swallowed, the hope you guarded, even when no one asked. These 3 judges didn't stop cycles of rebellion. They simply provided oases of order in a chaotic time. And sometimes, that's enough. Peace isn't always the absence of war, it's the presence of stewardship. And stewardship, however humble, is sacred. So tonight, as you rest, take comfort. You don't have to be remembered by history to be cherished by God. Your ordinary faithfulness is stitching peace into a fractured world, one quiet act at a time. Breathe. You are seen. You are enough. And your life, even in its keenest moments, matters deeply to the one who names the stars and counts your size. Before he ever touched a jawbone or carried a gate, he was a promise, whispered in the silence of a barren woman's heart. An angel came not in thunder, but in quiet awe, and said, "You will conceive and give birth to a son. He will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines." Judges 13:5. His name would be Samson, which means sunshine or like the sun, a radiant hope in a dark time. He would be a Nazirite from birth. No wine, no unclean food, no razor on his head. Set apart, holy, a living sign that God had not forgotten his people. But from the beginning, his story was marked by tension not just between Israel and the Philistines, but within Samson himself. He was born for divine purpose, yet drawn to human pleasure, chosen by God, yet restless among his own people, strong enough to tear lions apart, yet weak before the smile of a woman, and beneath it all, loneliness, profound, aching loneliness. He never had a mentor, no Deborah to counsel him, no Gideon to model humility. He was raised in Zorah, a small village, under his parents' watchful eyes. But the text never says he walked with elders, studied with priests, or fellowshipped with other faithful. He was set apart, but not connected. And isolation, even when holy, can twist the soul. So he wandered into Philistine territory, not as a spy, but as a seeker. Seeking what? Adventure? Acceptance? A place where his strangeness might be unnoticed? He saw a woman in Timnah and said, "Get her for me as my wife." Judges 14:2. His parents pleaded, "Isn't there an Israelite woman you can marry?" But he insisted, not out of love, but perhaps out of the deep human need to belong. Even in the wrong places, his strength was supernatural, but his heart was human. He solved riddles, burned fields, killed in anger, and yet no one truly knew him. He was used, again and again, by his parents, who tried to manage his outbursts, by the Philistines, who feared him, by his lovers, who sought his secrets, but who loved him for himself, who saw past the muscles to the man trembling beneath. You know this loneliness, don't you? The kind that can't be filled by success, by attention, by even the most passionate relationship. The kind that whispers, "No one really sees you." Samson had fame, power, desire, but no intimacy. He was surrounded, yet solitary. And in that void, he kept reaching for the wrong hands to hold him. Yet God never abandoned him. Even when Samson made foolish choices, God's Spirit came upon him, rushing on him like wind through a canyon. Judges 14:6. Not because Samson was pure, but because God's promise was greater than his failure. Samson was never meant to finish the deliverance, only to begin it. A spark, not the flame. A crack in the Philistine wall, not the collapse. His tragedy wasn't his strength, it was his solitude. He carried a divine calling, but no community to ground it, and so his power became his prison. He could break ropes, but not habits. He could kill thousands, but not his own emptiness. But even in his brokenness, grace lingered, because the God who met him in the womb also met him in the prison. And one day, in the darkness of Gaza, blind and grinding grain like a beast, Samson would whisper a prayer that changed everything. But that is for another night. For now, rest in this truth. You were not made to carry your calling alone. Strength without connection is a slow kind of death. But even in your loneliness, God sees you. He has not forgotten your name. And like Samson, you are still part of a story that is not yet finished. It began with a wedding, but not a joyful one. Samson, the Nazarite, set apart for God, stood in the midst of 30 Philistine companions, forced into celebration by custom, surrounded by enemies dressed as friends. He had chosen a Philistine bride, not out of love, but perhaps out of defiance or desperation. And in that uneasy gathering, he proposed a riddle. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. Judges 14:14. If they solved it in 7 days, he'd give them 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If not, they'd owe him the same. It was a gamble, part showmanship, part cry for acknowledgement. He wanted to prove he was smarter, stronger, untouchable. But beneath the bravado was a heart already bleeding. For 7 days, the Philistines pressured his bride. Coax your husband to explain the riddle, or we'll burn you and your father's household. And so, worn down by fear, she wept on Samson's shoulder, not with honesty, but with manipulation. You don't really love me, she cried. Judges 14:16. And Samson, so desperate to be loved, even falsely, finally gave in. He told her the answer. A lion he had killed, from whose carcass bees had made honey. The sweetness from the strong, the life from the dead. A truth almost prophetic. But the betrayal cut deep. When the Philistines shouted the answer on the 7th day, Samson knew. And in that moment, his pain turned to fury. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him not in worship, but in wrath. He went to Ashkelon, struck down 30 men, stripped their garments, and paid his debt in blood. Then he left his bride behind, walking away from the altar, not as a husband, but as a ghost. But the wound festered. When he returned later to claim her, he learned she'd been given to another. Her father said, I thought you thoroughly hated her. Judges 15:2. And something in Samson snapped. Not just grief, but the crushing realization that he had never truly belonged. Not to Israel, not to the Philistines, not even to the woman he thought loved him. So he took revenge not with armies, but with fire. He caught 300 foxes, tied them tail to tail, and set a torch between each pair. Then he released them into the Philistines' fields. The flames raced through standing grain, olive groves, vineyards' entire harvests turned to ash. It was chaos, born of heartbreak, not strategy, not justice, just pain, unleashed. You've felt this, haven't you? That moment when rejection twists into rage, when loneliness becomes recklessness, when you lash out not because you're cruel, but because your heart has no safe place to land. Samson didn't burn the fields to win a war. He burned them because no one saw his tears. Yet even in his fury, God was at work. The Philistines retaliated by burning his bride and father-in-law, a horror that only deepened the cycle. But from this fire, a path opened. The men of Judah, afraid of Philistine wrath, bound Samson and handed him over. And there, in the rock of Etam, with ropes on his wrists, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him again. The bonds snapped like thread, and with the jawbone of a donkey, he struck down 1,000 men. But notice, after the battle, Samson was not triumphant. He was thirsty, exhausted, near death, and he cried out, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst?" Judges 15:18. Even in power, He was fragile. Even in victory, he was desperate. So tonight, if your heart is burning from betrayal, from loneliness, from the ache of being used, don't let your pain become a torch that destroys what you love. Bring it to God. Like Samson, cry out in your thirst, because the one who split the rock for water can turn even your foxfire into a path of grace. She is remembered as the serpent in silk, the woman who kissed Samson while sharpening the knife of betrayal. But what if her story is less about evil and more about erosion? Less about malice and more about the slow surrender of integrity for the sake of comfort, security, or survival. The Bible doesn't tell us Delilah's tribe. She may have been Philistine. She may have been Israelite. She may have been a foreigner caught between worlds, with no true home, no lasting protection, only the fragile safety of a powerful man's favor. And when the lords of the Philistines came to her with silver 1,100 pieces each, a fortune beyond dreams, they didn't just ask for secrets. They offered her a future. See if you can lure him and find out how he can be overpowered. Judges 16-5. At first, she refused. Or at least, she delayed. 3 times, Samson gave her false answers. Ropes, new bowstrings, woven hair. And 3 times, the Philistines waited in ambush, only to watch Samson break free like smoke through fingers. And each time, Delilah grew more anxious, not just because the plan failed, but because the net was tightening around her. The lords weren't patient men. Their generosity had an expiration date, and her value was tied to her usefulness. So she pressed harder, not with threats, but with intimacy. How can you say, "I love you," when your heart is not with me? She whispered. Judges 16:15. The cruelest weapon is not a blade, but the echo of a lover's doubt. And Samson, starved for trust, finally broke. He told her everything, the truth about his hair, his vow, his weakness. And that night, while he slept on her lap, she called the Philistines. They shaved his head, and the strength left him, not because hair holds power, but because covenant had been broken. But don't rush to condemn her. Ask instead, when have I traded truth for security? When have I softened my convictions because someone offered me approval, money, or peace? Delilah didn't wake up that morning planning to destroy a deliverer. She simply chose, again and again, to please the powerful instead of protecting the vulnerable. She mistook loyalty to a system for wisdom. She believed that survival meant compromise. And in that, she is not so different from us. We live in a world that rewards conformity, that whispers, "Just go along to get along," that says, "Don't make waves, don't speak up, keep your head down." And slowly, without realizing it, we begin to betray not just others, but our own conscience. We stay silent when we should speak. We laugh at jokes that wound. We accept injustice because it benefits us. We tell ourselves it's just one small lie, one small silence, one small surrender. But like Delilah, we don't see the damage until the strength is gone. Yet even here, grace lingers. The text never says God punished Delilah. It simply records her role in Samson's fall and then lets her fade. But in that silence, there's room for mercy. Maybe she lived the rest of her life, haunted by what she'd done. Maybe she wept in the dark, wishing she'd chosen differently. Maybe she, too, became a prisoner of the very system she served. So tonight, as you rest, don't point a finger. Look in the mirror. Where have you been, Delilah? Not in grand betrayal, but in quiet compromise? And if you have, know this: There is still time to choose loyalty, to protect the vulnerable, to speak the truth, even when it costs you. Because the God who restored Samson in the prison can restore you in your regret. The blade touched his scalp, and the world changed. Not with thunder, not with fire, just the soft whisper of steel against skin and the sudden, terrifying absence of power. Samson woke not to the rush of the spirit, but to the mocking laughter of enemies. His hair shorn, scattered like dust on the floor, his strength gone, not because God abandoned him, but because he had abandoned his covenant. And then came the worst cruelty of all. They gouged out his eyes, not just to blind him, but to humiliate him. A strong man reduced to stumbling darkness. A deliverer turned into a spectacle. They bound him in bronze shackles and dragged him to Gaza, to the prison where he would grind grain, a task reserved for beasts and slaves. Day after day, his hands turned the millstone, his shoulders bent, his face empty. No one came to visit. No one whispered hope. The Israelites, who once trembled at his name, now looked away. The Philistines, who once feared him, now paraded him as proof that their gods were stronger. And in that silence, Samson disappeared, not in body, but in spirit. The man who once roared like a lion now moved like a ghost. But here, in the deepest pit of his life, something unexpected began to grow. Humility, not forced, not performative, but the quiet surrender of a man who finally understood his limits. He had trusted in his strength, his charm, his rage. He had believed he could dance on the edge of compromise and never fall. But now, stripped of everything sight, freedom, honor, he had nothing left but dependence. And in that emptiness, God drew near. The Bible says simply, "But the hair on his head began to grow again." Judges 16:22. Not as a magical fix, not as an instant restoration, but as a slow, quiet sign. Covenant was being rewoven. Grace was returning, not because Samson had earned it, but because God's mercy outlasts our failure. The same God who met him in his mother's womb now met him in his prison cell. And in that darkness, Samson began to pray not for revenge, but for remembrance. You know what it's like to sit in your own Gaza, to feel blind to the future, bound by past mistakes, grinding the same stone of regret day after day. Maybe your prison isn't literal. Maybe it's addiction, shame, a broken relationship, a dream that died. And you wonder, has God forgotten me? But hear this, your lowest place is not your final place. Samson's blindness became the doorway to his clearest vision. His weakness became the vessel for God's strength. His silence became the space where prayer could finally grow. The Philistines thought they had won, but God was not done, and neither is he with you. So if you're in the mill tonight, turning stone after stone, heart heavy with what you've lost, don't mistake your season of silence for abandonment. Sometimes, God allows the hair to grow back in secret, the strength to rebuild in stillness, the purpose to renew in solitude. Samson didn't know it yet, but his greatest act of faith was still ahead. Not in tearing lions apart, but in whispering, "Sovereign Lord, remember me." And that prayer, fragile, honest, desperate, was enough. They brought him to Dagon's temple not to worship, but to mock. Thousands gathered, lords, women, children, all laughing at the broken giant led by a child's hand. Our God has delivered Samson, the destroyer of our land, into our hands, they shouted. Judges 16:24. They believed their victory was complete. Their gods had won. Israel's last hope was a blind prisoner, paraded like a trophy. And in that moment, Samson could have curled into himself, swallowed his shame, and let the jeers wash over him like rain. But something stirred in the darkness behind his eyes. He asked the servant guiding him, "Let me feel the pillars that hold up the temple." Judges 16:26. Not out of curiosity, out of memory, out of a quiet, dawning purpose. And as his hands rested on the stone-cold, solid, central, he did what he had never truly done before. He prayed. Not a boast, not a demand, but a raw, trembling plea. "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me die with the Philistines." Judges 16:28. Notice what he didn't ask for. He didn't ask to be healed. He didn't ask to escape. He didn't ask for honor or revenge. He asked only to be remembered and to give his life for his people. This was not suicide. This was sacrifice. Not the reckless act of a broken man, but the final obedience of a redeemed one. He had spent his life seeking personal satisfaction, wives, riddles, revenge, but in his last breath he chose solidarity. "Let me die with the Philistines" wasn't a cry of despair. It was a strategic surrender. He knew the temple's pillars were load-bearing. He knew the crowd was dense. He knew his strength would return not for glory, but for deliverance. And so, with his arms outstretched like a man embracing his fate, he pushed. The roof collapsed. 3,000 died, including Samson. But Israel was set free, not fully, not finally. But the Philistine grip was broken, and the cycle of judges turned once more toward hope. Samson's story ends not in failure, but in fulfillment. He did begin the deliverance of Israel. Judges 13-5. Not with perfection, but with a final faithful act. You may carry your own regrets tonight, choices that haunt you, patterns you can't break, a past you wish you could undo. But hear this: it is never too late for one surrendered moment to redeem a lifetime of wandering. God doesn't discard your story because of your stumbles. He weaves even your broken pieces into his purpose. Samson's greatest strength wasn't in his arms, it was in his prayer. His clearest vision wasn't with his eyes, it was in his surrender. And so, if you're weary of your own cycles of falling, rising, falling again, know this: your final chapter hasn't been written. One honest prayer, one act of trust, one yes in the darkness can shift everything. The temple may be shaking, but your hands are on the pillars, and God is listening. It began with a mother's grief and a son's guilt. Micah stole 1,100 pieces of silver from his own mother. When she cursed the thief, not knowing it was her son, he trembled, confessed, and returned the money. And in her relief, she didn't scold him. She blessed him and then said, "I solemnly consecrate this silver to the Lord to make a carved image." Judges 17-3. Not out of rebellion, not out of malice, but out of a sincere, tangled desire to honor God. She took 200 pieces and hired a silversmith. And from that silver, they made an idol, a statue, wrapped in religious language, shaped by human hands, placed in a household shrine. Then Micah built a private chapel, appointed one of his sons as priest, and declared, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me." Judges 17:13. But there was no altar in Shiloh, no ark, no high priest, just a homemade religion, convenient, controlled, and completely cut off from the truth. And then a Levite wandered by a young man from Bethlehem, technically qualified to serve, but rootless, unemployed, willing to be hired. Micah offered him 10 shekels a year, a set of clothes, and room and board. And the Levite said yes, not because he believed in Micah's God, but because he needed a job. And so, in a house in the hills of Ephraim, a new kind of worship was born. Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since this Levite has become my priest." Judges 17:13. But it wasn't the Lord. It was a god of their making, shaped by silver, hired by salary, housed in a shrine no larger than a closet. This is the quiet danger of DIY faith. It feels spiritual, but it's centered on self. It uses God's name, but serves human comfort. It looks like devotion, but it's really control. Micah didn't reject God. He just wanted a version he could manage, one who didn't demand too much, one who fit neatly into his home, his schedule, his preferences. You've seen this in our time too. The God who blesses your politics but never challenges your pride. The Jesus who only speaks in affirmations, never in repentance. The faith that's customized like a playlist, skipping the hard psalms, the cross, the call to die to self. Micah's idol wasn't loud. It didn't demand child sacrifice or wild rituals. It was quiet, respectable, even pious. But it was still idolatry, because it replaced the living God with a manageable symbol. And the tragedy deepened when the Danites came, tribe without territory, desperate for a sign. They saw Micah's idol, stole it, took the Levite, and set it up in their new city. And the young priest, eager for status, went willingly. The idol that began as a mother's offering became a tribal mascot. Truth was traded for convenience. Worship became portable but empty. The Bible marks this with a haunting refrain. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Judges 17:6. Not evil in their eyes right. They believed they were doing good, honoring God, building community. But without a true anchor, even good worship becomes a snare. So tonight, as you rest, gently ask, what have I made in my own image and called it God? What parts of my faith exist only because they make me comfortable? Where have I hired a priest, a teacher, a podcast, a book, not because they point to Christ, but because they affirm my preferences? True worship doesn't fit in a house. It reshapes the worshiper. It doesn't serve our agenda. It surrenders to his. Micah's idol is long dust, but the temptation remains to craft a God small enough to carry, instead of kneeling before the one who holds the stars. It began with a journey home. A Levite, traveling from the hill country of Ephraim, was returning with his concubine, a woman who had left him, perhaps wounded, perhaps weary, but now reconciled. They stopped in Gibeah, a town of Benjamin. As the sun set, they expected hospitality, safety, the basic decency of fellow Israelites. But no one invited them in, not at first, until an old man, a sojourner himself, opened his door and said, "You can't spend the night in the street. Come to my house." Judges 19:20. But that night, the men of the city surrounded the house. Not thieves, not foreigners. Men of Benjamin, the text says, Judges 19:22. Men of the same tribe, the same covenant, the same God. And they demanded the Levite be brought out so we can have sex with him. The language is chilling in its bluntness. This wasn't lust alone, it was dehumanization. The kind of violence that says, your dignity means nothing to me. In a moment that still haunts the conscience of Scripture, The old man offered his own virgin daughter, and the Levite pushed his concubine out the door. She was abused all night. At dawn, she crawled to the doorstep and died. And the Levite, instead of weeping, lifted her body onto his donkey and went home. Then he took a knife and cut her into 12 pieces, sending one to each tribe of Israel. This was not just a crime. It was a covenantal earthquake. For the first time in the story of God's people, the enemy wasn't Egypt, Moab, or Philistia. The enemy was within. The land wasn't defiled by outsiders, but by the very ones called to be holy. Hospitality, the sacred duty of ancient Near Eastern culture, had been replaced by predation. Protection had become betrayal. And a woman already vulnerable, already voiceless, became the silent witness to Israel's moral collapse. The Bible doesn't sensationalize her suffering. It doesn't give her a name. But in that anonymity, she becomes every person who has been used, discarded, and silenced by those who should have shielded them. Her story is not included to shock, but to sound an alarm. This is what happens when there is no king and no conscience. The tribes responded with outrage, rightly so. But their war against Benjamin, nearly wiping out an entire tribe, revealed their own brokenness. Justice without mercy, vengeance without wisdom. They mourned the violence, yet repeated it. They grieved the loss of one woman, yet nearly erased thousands of others in the aftermath. This chapter is the darkest in Judges, not because of the horror alone, but because it shows how easily holiness can rot from the inside out. When everyone does what is right in their own eyes, even God's people become monsters. You may feel the weight of this tonight, the pain of a world where the vulnerable are still sacrificed for comfort, where institutions protect the powerful, not the powerless, where silence becomes complicity. But hear this: God did not approve of what happened in Gibeah. His silence in the text is not consent, it is solemn judgment. And his heart breaks with every victim who crawls to a doorstep only to be turned away. The book of Judges includes this story not to shame, but to summon us back, to courage, to compassion, to the sacred duty of saying, "Not in my house, not on my watch, not while I have breath." Tonight, as you rest, hold this truth gently. You are not called to fix the whole world, but you are called to protect your corner of it, to open your door, to speak for the silent, to honor the dignity of every soul, especially the ones the world treats as disposable. The concubine has no name in Scripture, but she has a voice in its warning, and her cry echoes still. Remember me, and do better. Breathe. May your heart be a house where no one is turned away. May your hands be a shield for the ones who cannot shield themselves. And may we, unlike Gibeah, choose to see, to care, and to act with holy love. After the horror of Gibeah, Israel gathered not in worship, but in war. The 11 tribes demanded justice. Rightly so. The crime was unspeakable, but justice, when untethered from mercy, becomes its own kind of violence. They swore an oath. Not one of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjamite. Judges 21:1. A vow meant to punish evil, but it nearly erased an entire tribe from history. The battle was brutal. Benjamin, though outnumbered, fought with the desperation of cornered men, but after 3 days, only 600 survived, fleeing to the rock of Rimmon, hiding like ghosts in the wilderness. The land that once held 12 tribes now held 11, and a silence heavier than blood. And then came the reckoning, not from God but from their own hearts. "We are all one people," they whispered. Judges 21:6. The same tribes that had marched to war now sat in grief. They had purged evil, but at what cost? They had upheld righteousness, but orphaned a brother tribe. Their oath, once righteous, now felt like a chain. How could they let Benjamin vanish? The covenant people were tearing themselves apart. So they sought a way, however flawed, to restore what was nearly lost. First, they attacked Jabesh Gilead, a city that hadn't joined the war, and spared only the virgin women, 400 of them, to give to the Benjamites as wives. But it wasn't enough. Still, 200 men remained without brides, and so they devised another plan. During a yearly festival at Shiloh, they told the daughters of Israel to go dance in the vineyards. Then they instructed the Benjamites to come out of hiding, seize wives for themselves, and carry them away. The fathers, bound by the oath not to give their daughters, could claim they didn't consent, though they surely knew. It was a solution stitched with loopholes, draped in sorrow. No celebration, no joy, only survival. This is the tragedy of moral collapse. Even when we do the right thing, the brokenness lingers. Israel had stood against evil, but in doing so, they nearly destroyed themselves. They saved justice, but lost peace. They upheld purity, but forgot compassion. And the land, once flowing with milk and honey, now echoed with the weeping of women taken, tribes diminished, and oaths that bound more than they blessed. You've seen this in our world too. Movements that begin in truth but end in bitterness. Wars fought for righteousness that leave generations scarred. Systems that punish so thoroughly they forget to heal. The book of Judges doesn't celebrate this moment. It laments it. Because when God's people turn on each other, everyone loses, even the victors. And so the refrain returns, like a sigh over a grave. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Judges 21:25. Not evil right. They believed they were doing good, protecting holiness, upholding covenant. But without a true center, without a king who rules with both justice and mercy, their righteousness became ruin. Tonight, as you rest, let this story soften your heart. Stand against evil, yes, but never lose sight of the image of God in your enemy. Never let your zeal erase your humanity, because a people who cannot restore what they've broken will always live in the shadow of their own wounds. Benjamin survived barely, and Israel was never the same. So breathe and pray for wisdom, to hate what is evil, but to love what is true, even when it's hard, even when it costs you, even when it means making space for the one you once called enemy. In the same days that Israel was tearing itself apart, when brothers fought brothers, when oaths led to exile, when violence echoed through the hills of Benjamin, something else was happening. Quietly, tenderly. In the barley fields of Bethlehem, a foreign woman knelt in the dirt, gathering grain behind the reapers. Her name was Ruth, a Moabitess, an outsider, a widow. And yet, she would become the thread that stitched hope back into the torn fabric of Israel's story. Her journey began in loss. She buried her husband, her brother-in-law, her father-in-law. Left alone in a foreign land with her grieving mother-in-law, Naomi, she faced a future with no safety net, no inheritance, no name. And when Naomi urged her to return to Moab, to her gods, her family, her chance at a new life, Ruth spoke words that still shimmer with devotion. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Ruth 1:16. Not out of duty, not out of desperation, but out of love. A love so fierce it crossed borders, defied logic, and clung to a God she barely knew. She didn't know it, but her loyalty would become legend. She didn't know it, but her humility would birth a king. In the fields of Boaz, a distant kinsman of Naomi's husband Ruth found grace, not because she demanded it, but because she worked quietly, reverently, trusting that provision might come. And Boaz, seeing her kindness to Naomi and her reverence for the God of Israel, said, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth 2:12. Notice, the wings of God were not over palaces or battlefields. They were over a foreign widow, kneeling in a field, gleaning leftover grain. This is the quiet counter-narrative to Judges. While Israel spiraled into chaos, God was weaving redemption in the margins. While men fought over oaths and idols, a woman chose covenant through kindness. While tribes turned on each other, a Moabitess became family. And from this unlikely union, Boaz and Ruth, the line of David, began. And from David's line, centuries later, came the one who would finally be Israel's true king, the one who would end the cycle of rebellion and rescue, not with fire but with flesh, not with war, but with a manger, not with judgment, but with a cross. Ruth's story is tucked into the chaos of Judges like a lullaby in the middle of a storm. It doesn't deny the darkness. It simply insists that light still grows there. You may feel like you're living in your own days of Judges, a time of confusion, moral drift, or personal brokenness. Maybe you're an outsider too, feeling unworthy, unseen, unsure. You belong. But Ruth whispers to you across the centuries, your past does not disqualify you. Your foreignness is not a barrier. Your quiet faithfulness is not unnoticed. God sees the gleaner in the field. He honors the one who chooses love over convenience. He raises up hope from the least likely places. So tonight, as you rest, let Ruth's story be your comfort. Even in the darkest chapter of history, grace was at work. Even in the silence between the screams of Judges, a widow's footsteps sounded like the first notes of a new song. And that song, it's still being sung. In you, in me, in every heart that dares to say, your people will be my people. Your God, my God. We've walked through long nights together, nights of rebellion and rescue, of whispers and weeping, of judges who failed and women who saved, of idols made of silver and vows made in sorrow, of tribes tearing themselves apart, and one foreign widow stitching hope back together with her bare hands. The book of Judges doesn't end with a victory march. It ends with a sigh. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But that sigh is not the final word, because after the silence of Judges comes the song of Ruth. After the chaos comes the crown of David. And after David, centuries later, comes a child born in Bethlehem, the very town where Ruth gleaned grain, where Micah built his idol, where hope once seemed lost. This child would not be like the Judges. He would not deliver for a season, he would redeem forever. He would not rule by strength. He would reign through sacrifice. He would not leave us to our own eyes. He would become our true king, our faithful priest, our perfect deliverer. And his name? Emmanuel, God with us. That is the quiet answer to every cry in Judges. Not a better system, not a stronger leader, but a God who enters the mess, who walks into wine presses with trembling men, who sits under palm trees with wise women, who weeps with daughters on the mountains, who stands in prison cells with the blind and broken, and who gathers even the nameless, the forgotten, the foreign, into his story. You may be lying there tonight carrying your own cycle. Rebellion, regret, crying out, rescue, only to stumble again. You may feel like Gideon hiding in a pit, like Deborah standing alone under a tree, like Samson strong on the outside, empty within, like Jephthah's daughter grieving a future that never came, like the Levite's concubine used, discarded, voiceless. But hear this, beloved, your story does not end in Judges. It finds its rest in the one who said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. He is the King Israel longed for. He is the deliverer who doesn't just break chains. He renews hearts. He doesn't just give peace for 40 years. He gives shalom that guards your mind, your soul, your sleep. So let go now. Let the weight of your wandering fall away. You don't have to fix yourself tonight. You don't have to be strong. You don't have to have all the answers. Just rest, because the stars that watched over Deborah still watch over you. The same God who heard Israel's groan hears your sigh. The same grace that grew Samson's hair is restoring you, slowly, surely, in the quiet. And you are not alone, not in your doubt, not in your failure, not in your silence. He is with you, not because you've earned it, but because he promised it. So close your eyes, breathe deeply. Let the rhythm of your breath become a lullaby of trust. The night is long, but the dawn is coming. And until then, you are held. Sleep now, child of the King. You are seen. You are loved. You are home.